In this video, we're diving into a seminal gem. Wow, sounds questionable out loud, huh? Diablo 4 is casting a shadow over the world, and the masses are hyped to a cautious, frothing optimism. So, what better time to get stuck into the game that started it all? We're diving into Diablo 1 to discover how it became the genesis for an entire franchise. Nay, for an entire genre, the action RPG. The hyperbole leveled at the Diablo franchise is legendary, but, as with all legendary tales, it begins with something more humble. So, sharpen your blade, patch up your leather armor, and fill that belt with potions. We're piercing the dark veil of magic that surrounds Tristram to figure out why it's endearing, so many years after Diablo's launch.
Hello, my friend. Stay a while and listen.
The inspiration for Diablo is worth a quick nod. The title came to Diablo's lead designer David Brevik when he was a young tyke. Brevik went to school in the California Bay Area. A nearby peak, named Mount Diablo, stuck with him as he daydreamed about the kind of games he could make. The video game Rogue was a large inspiration during Diablo's concept phase. Specifically, the randomly generated dungeons, random loot, and permadeath appealed to Brevik, and this guided the initial design for Diablo. Permadeath would later be dropped. Blizzard North was also inspired by a recent Star Wars title which you might have heard of, Dark Forces. The map feature of Dark Forces was an overhead, fully scalable mass of green, yellow, and red lines, which resembled the outline and elevation of a level. It looked more like an architect's drawing than a game map. Other role-playing games were using hand-drawn maps and lacked a fidelity that Blizzard North was after. The team tweaked and implemented this design into their own maps, which resulted in an isometric map that closely resembled the in-game environment, and had an incredible amount of detail for the time. Blizzard North also wanted the user interface to be as simple as possible. It had to survive the mum test, as Brevik put it. Could my mum play this? The idea was to make it intuitive enough that players could jump right in and understand the major mechanics without being beaten to death by a telephone book for a manual. It's not clear whether Mum was ultimately involved, but I'd say the end result met the vision. A 4-man crack squad of writers went above and beyond to fill the manual with interesting story and lore. They understood their target audience and made sure every page was saturated with interesting stuff to absorb. The manual is chock with backstory and information for lore nuts, and Didier and Metzen's drawings are still a detailed and iconic delight. Look at this art. Really, look at it. I'm sure there were many more influences, but these were the ones that spoke to me. Behold, traveller, we have arrived at Tristram. The dark gameplay of Diablo takes place in and under the town of Tristram. Tristram is referred to in the manual as a city, but there's little support for this vision in the game. The opening cinematic shows a warrior investigating gutted homes, which hints at the possible fate of the city. The simple squat buildings, however, are more at home in a rural setting. It's easy to imagine woodsmen felling trees, farmers mucking sties and repairing fences, and the local blacksmith sweating over the repair of a horseshoe. There is little here to suggest a civilization more advanced than quaint country. Well, it would be quaint if everyone wasn't on edge. The game begins with the hero standing at the outskirts of town. Polite conversation with the townsfolk reveal that the hero once lived here, which is at odds with the manual, as only the warrior is described as having returned from the wars in the north. The rogue and sorcerer are said to have travelled from the east, drawn by the dark murmurs of a goings-on in Tristram. The discrepancy is a result of the late inclusion of character classes, when it was too late to change the story. A curio, but we press on. The returning protagonist is a trope in fiction, and it usually signals conflict, with either the hero or the town having changed, and one unable to accommodate the other. Friction is guaranteed. In Diablo, this trope has the opposite effect in gameplay, reducing the friction between the townsfolk and the hero, and allowing more open and natural conversation immediately. This is an important point because it speaks to the action-oriented design that Blizzard North was shooting for. Reduce the barrier to entry for the player. The townsfolk have been ravaged by dark riders and strange creatures which roam the countryside. They have become wary of outsiders, like the witch Adria on the outskirts of town. Giving the hero a familiar face makes townsfolk more trusting and eager to help. Obviously, this is at odds with the story of the rogue and the sorcerer, but it's clear where the concessions were made. If we accept that Tristram was once a city, all that's left now is a ramshackle collection of aged wood, dishevelled people, and fearful souls. A hopeless nowhere, which is too stubborn to crumble into the earth or to stomach its own inevitable fate. Instead, the people cling to a faint spark of dying civilization. It's emblematic of the stubborn human spirit, to a fault. Tristram appears to be under a permanent twilight, the world awash in bruised blue and purple, punctuated by timid shards of orange light. Fires may have blotted out the sun, night could have fallen, or something more sinister could be suppressing the light. The oppressive feeling is heightened by the now iconic Tristram theme which plays while the hero is in town. It's a beautiful piece of music, haunting and despondent, but with a daring, plucky dash of hope, a perfect complement to an imperfect place. Complementing the menace which stalks the countryside is the talk of horrors emerging from the depths of the old monastery. Some of the townsfolk can directly attest to the ferocity of the demons. The hero arrives in Tristram shortly after a mob of townsfolk, deceived and emboldened by the traitorous Archbishop Lazarus, storm the monastery to reclaim the young Prince Albrecht. Albrecht represents their best chance at normality now that Leoric is dead, and they cling to it like a security blanket, bellow it as a battle cry with torches and pitchforks raised. Lazarus deserts them, however, and the townsfolk are slaughtered by the horrors in the chill dark. Few return, and wounds are still freshly salved. A survivor, having managed to crawl back to the surface, has collapsed outside the monastery and, with the last of his strength, gasps of the grotesque visage of the creature known as the Butcher, which awaited them, cleaving townsfolk and adorning them on his walls as though they were pigs fresh for the slaughter. None bear the scars worse than Farnham, the town drunk. He might seem like a jovial, inebriated fella, but he is irrevocably broken. Farnham was there with his friends when the Butcher appeared, and though Farnham returned physically unharmed, a darkness has coated his soul. He breaks down in what is easily the most disturbing dialogue delivered in the game.
Big cleaver, killing all my friends. Couldn't stop him, had to run away, couldn't save them. Trapped in a room with so many bodies, so many friends. No!
Farnham is well written and voice acted. Not too much dialogue, not too little, just enough to show both sides of the same tarnished but cherished coin. His mood swings depending on the topic, but his quips always made me smile, and there's a brutal, honest humanity to him. He's the sort of bloke you could sit at with a bar and share a joke over a pint of ale, and his relatable nature makes it all the more tragic. You're told by the townsfolk that Farnham's drunken stupor is a recent condition brought about by the carnage he witnessed under the cathedral, but chatting with Farnham reveals the unfathomable maw of his trauma. Wirt, a young smuggler boy, does not go unscathed either, but he's more functional than Farnham. Wirt, his mother, and a handful of other villagers were taken by the demons, dragged into the depths and tortured. Griswold braved the monastery and managed to rescue some of them. Wirt's mother sustained minor injuries, but the Butcher took Wirt's left leg for his gruesome trophy room. The boy was healed and a wooden peg affixed to the stump. He now despises his wooden leg. Wirt's mother died not long after their rescue, despite her minor injuries. Gillian, the local barmaid, believes she died of a broken heart over what happened to her boy. The boy's soul is tainted now, as noted by many of the townsfolk when they express sorrow at his situation. Wirt seems wholly unaware of his black shift in personality and his redoubled thirst for gold. Griswold, the blacksmith, was one of the people who took up arms to brave the crypts and save his fellow villagers after they stormed below. He returned having witnessed horrors. If anything, he is more driven to lending his talents to a promising adventurer who might annihilate the evil and restore peace to Tristram. This drive is misguided to the point of overzealous. In the quest, Anvil of Fury, he asks the hero to retrieve an anvil used by the Forge Masters of Hell to craft their strongest weapons. If the hero retrieves it for him, he can use it to craft a powerful item for the hero. This is a boneheaded thing to do. Take something that is chaotic and corruptible in its very nature and bring it to the surface for the perceived purpose of good. There's no doubt that Griswold has the best interest and care of his fellow townsfolk at heart, but it's hard to believe that his soul isn't clouded with a judgment call like that. Throughout the grim adventure, we hear tales of insidious corruption of the bravest, strongest, most devout of souls. Iswol, lieutenant to Archangel Tyrael, falls prey to the corruption and becomes a champion of Hell after an ill-conceived assault on the Hellforge. The warning of Hell's power is crystal clear, and Diablo's influence spreads far beyond the town. Is this not enough to make the villagers wary of any perverted artifacts recovered from the depths? Is it possible to overlook these events and assume that Griswold expected a plain blacksmith's anvil from the Hellforge? Seems questionable, doesn't it? Pepin is the local healer. Get used to his indistinct face. You visit him a lot. Pepin seems like a lovely guy. Light disposition, a care for those around him, a healer by trade. He offers some quests which includes purifying the town well and recovering a demon brain to make an elixir. The latter is a bit weird for a healer, but it's Ogden's comment which is the most interesting.
Pepin is a good man, and certainly the most generous in the village. He's always attending to the needs of others, but trouble of some sort or another does seem to follow him wherever he goes.
Pepin is a healer. It's logical to assume that he would go where he is needed the most. Right? There couldn't be a subtle, dark calling at play, a tug so imperceptible that Pepin heeds phantom cries of the wounded. There couldn't be. Could there? Gillian and Ogden work at the local tavern and are set dressing. They both have their own stories and opinions which add texture to other characters and events, but they're still set dressing. Tristram doesn't get many travellers anymore, so their tales are anecdotal or based on rumour. Of all the characters in Tristram, these two appear the most normal. They hear about the darkness and they believe, but they haven't experienced it firsthand. There's an apathy, a lack of urgency to their predicament, bolstered by the protection of other survivors in Tristram. It sounds ridiculous until you realise that this is human behaviour. Our minds are predisposed to rationalise anything we can't explain, no matter how over the top it might be. The threat isn't great enough to leave. A life can still be scraped from the smouldering charcoal, and, for now, what remains is relatively normal. It's funny how the normal waterline can change so drastically, yet everything appears normal. Adria the Witch is the wild card of Tristram, a newcomer who seemingly appeared out of nowhere around the time that the trouble started. People know little about her, even the scholarly Cain, but she offers the hero advice and sells items and is invaluable to players who like flexing their mana muscle. Not that muscle, empty that flask. It would be surprising that the villagers hadn't driven her out already if they weren't arsehole puckeringly scared of her. Even Cain is cautious, and he should be. Adria keeps pace with Cain's wisdom, outclassing him on a number of occasions, hinting at her power and experience which potentially outstrips anyone at Tristram. Adria knows a great deal about what is happening to Tristram, and you get the impression that she's more curious than concerned, keeping the people at arm's length. She knows she frightens them and does nothing to discourage it. She is complicit in Tristram's woes, having not warned the townsfolk of the imminent threat, even as the hero relates the grisly findings which she demonstrates an intimate knowledge of. It's a shame that her lines are overacted. Listening to her dialogue is on par with a Randy Pitchford stage performance.
To cast them with equal ability. Their weakness is that they must first be read aloud and can never be kept at the ready in your mind.
And that leaves us with Cain, resident greybeard and winner of the most quotable character category. Cain appears knowledgeable, but it's clear from listening to him for a while that most of his words are pulled from study crunch and not lived experience. I have a confession to make. I was annoyed with Kane initially. Surely with all that knowledge and history under his belt, he would have known about Diablo under the monastery, read the ominous signs, and raised the alarm well before now. No one is better equipped to understand what is happening, save perhaps Adria. And yet Kane fumbles his way from story to story, failing to reach the inevitable conclusion, even as the hero slaughters legions of demons and encounters macabre monsters like the Butcher. Surely Kane is also complicit in the corruption and death of his fellow townsfolk. Except he is a part of Tristram, has been for a long time. He is afflicted by the same herd apathy as the rest of the townsfolk. The truth has stared Kane in the face since Leoric began a descent to madness, but it happened in degrees small enough to escape scrutiny. It still annoys me a bit, but I'm warming to Kane's naivete despite his cranial library. Kane isn't so much wise as he is learned. He also has one of the most grandfatherly and endearing voices in the franchise. There is a pervasive darkness among the survivors which becomes more palpable as you visit them. They speak of hope and grit and determination, but remain huddled near the feeble light. Tristram is ruled by fear and uncertainty, and it is this uncertainty that causes the most harm. This uncertainty which predatorially rationalizes that everything will be okay, that things will return to normal. Tristram feels like a place that the hero is free to enter, but unable to leave. They are just as trapped as the townsfolk until the evil is banished, or until they succumb to the growing malevolent corruption. The darkness extends to the lands. The leaves of the trees are a sickly colour, shedding their paper-thin selves. The grass is patchy like an itching rash. What light remains gleams coldly off the stones surrounding the town. Despite all this, Tristram is a safe place for the hero to regroup, restock, and gain useful insight from Farnham.
Okay, so listen. There's this chamber of wood, see? And his wife, her, tells the tree, because you gotta wait. Then I says that might work against him, but if you think I'm gonna pay for this, yeah!
The people of Tristram mostly exist to offer their services to the hero. The lore they impart adds flavour and tone which deepen the horrors of the labyrinth with graphic detail and evocative imagery. David Brevik envisioned a different game to the other RPGs being released at the time. As a fan of Dungeons & Dragons, he had always enjoyed the meat and potatoes of the experience, the combat, and it was this concept which Diablo was built upon. Anything that didn't serve that purpose was cut from the game. It was a bold move at the time, and it had a noticeable impact on Tristram's inhabitants, who exist mostly for the benefit of the player, except for Ogden and Gillian, who are criminally underused. It's hard to argue against Brevik's choice. It streamlines the hero's time spent in town to a minute or two instead of getting bogged down in dialogue. The option is there to chase lore if you want, to gather opinions on every quest, but the action always beckons. It was a smart decision to center the conflict on a single town and its ragtag group of survivors. There aren't any competing agencies or ancillary characters to keep tabs on. Everyone you need to know is in town, gathered within easy reach, praying for your victory. Of all the images in Diablo, nothing is more symbolic than the monastery. It sits at the edge of town, looming over the townsfolk with severe grey lines. Inside the monastery grounds, gravestones are ragged bony fingers piercing through the earth. Blood-red light spills from every window, painting red lances across the grass. There is no moment more powerful than approaching the grave threshold of the monastery entrance for the first time. It's red and wide open, and makes no attempt to prevent the hero's entry. The monastery is a perfect representation of purity perverted. The structure was originally built to house the Haradrim, but it resembles a traditional place of worship. This was a deliberate design choice. Unlike holy places in the real world, in fantasy settings they are usually treated as a sanctity, a haven for those seeking refuge from the evils of the world. They are incorruptible conduits between humanity and the gods, an idealistic place of piety and light. To witness the fall of such a place is a powerful statement of the evil dwelling within. Corrupted sanctums are a trope, and for good reason. They are effective at conveying evil. Writer Stephen King has twisted religion in many of his works, often giving it a sinister and zealous bent. Holy places are not exempt from corruption, and in Tristram's case, the monastery has transformed into the breeding ground. It is a powerful symbolism which demonstrates that nowhere is safe. This single image of bloodied light spilling from the ancient building imparts everything the hero should expect about the journey ahead. Monasteries are also portals. In the traditional sense, they are the gateway to spirituality, to history, and to artistic expression through art and architecture. These hallmarks hold true for Tristram's monastery in a less conventional way, as the hero quickly discovers. The monastery is the facade for the labyrinth below.
The sanctity of this place has been fouled.
And this is where the hero spends most of their time. It's a randomly generated series of floors that burrow deep into the earth beneath Tristram. The technology used in their generation was groundbreaking for the time, though certainly not the first to the party. This was modern level randomization in its infancy. Blizzard North envisioned a game with infinite possibilities and, therefore, infinite replayability. They largely delivered. Every playthrough builds a unique iteration of the 16-level dungeon, with each level containing forks, dead ends, corridors, rooms, and loopbacks. Interactive items including chests, potions, bookcases, and barrels litter each level, placed arbitrarily by the randomization algorithm. It leads to a nonsensical layout which is completely fucking bonkers. Level randomization is explained as Diablo's terror warping the labyrinth under the monastery. Blizzard went to great pains to explain every detail of the game world, and it's consistent and cohesive. Even though I didn't feel a need for the explanations, there's zero doubt that they enhanced immersion for the setting. The setting changes as the hero travels deeper. The top levels are stone walls, ironworked fences, Romanesque columns, and lit torches. A basement and crypt for the Haradrim who guarded the monastery. The setting is dressed in dull grey and shadow, complemented by the moody soundtrack comprised of an ominous choir, the toll of bells, noises which echo in the distance, and an unnerving keen which undulates just below everything. This is the experience that comes to mind when I think Diablo. This track is seared into my childhood memory as representative of the Diablo 1 experience. It's my favourite track in the game. Have a listen. Cathedral soon gives way to catacombs, a muddy smear of dark stone which hint at the age of these levels. It's darker down here with fewer light sources and new demons lying in wait. Catacombs eventually open to caves, and it's here that Diablo's influence becomes apparent. Large pools and rivulets of lava fill these levels, and the hero encounters harder, more grotesque demons. There's a sense that these levels were once mines. The walls are propped with wooden beams and crude wooden pens dot the area. The wail and grunge of the guitar and the strange moans which haunt the soundtrack lead the hero across the threshold of Diablo's domain. It's not until the hero reaches the final levels that Diablo's perversion is fully realized. This is hell. Bone-walled structures filled with an unsettling red substance, chained and impaled bodies that have been viciously mangled or ripped in half in graphic detail, entrails smeared down walls or forming puddles on the ground. It's genuinely unsettling stuff. This is the fate which met the townsfolk when they charged into this damned place. Faced with such barbaric brutality, it's hardly surprising that Farnham knocked most of his marbles loose on the mad scrabble to flee. The implied violence on these levels excels at making you, as the player, feel like you shouldn't be here. Gone is any familiarity of the real world, replaced with hooks and chains and displays of barbarity so casual that they must be framed as demonic works of art. They are repulsive, and I couldn't help but dwell on the torture which these poor souls must have endured. It's a gut check of sorts, and I wanted the implacable hero to have something to say. A comment, a denouncement, a prayer for the dead. But the hero remains voiceless, their grim sights fixed on the horned, grinning prize at the end of the maze. Perhaps this focus is the only thing pinning the hero's sanity, despite champions of the light traditionally depicted in fantasy as stoic and unshakable. It's easier to allow the player to express their own feelings about the imagery, rather than let a voice speak for them. But this is one trope of old fantasy that didn't shake loose, and it would have been better for characterization if the hero had things to say about trudging through a realm of horrific death and dismemberment. The labyrinth is a descent into madness. Things become more surreal the further down the hero travels. The hostility and malevolence become more apparent. The hero, strangely, is unperturbed by all of this. The sin war is masked behind a veil of relative secrecy, and the hero should have greater reaction to the horrors they witness. Demons, hellspawn, undead, surely the hero would return a raving lunatic if they succeed. It makes the ending darkly appropriate for the setting. The most common question I see about Diablo 1 is whether it's worth playing so many years after launch. The answer is yes, but not for the gameplay. Credit where credit is due though. The formula was groundbreaking for its time. Random dungeons, random loot, an action RPG experience with light story and character development unlike other fantasy titles of the time. Brevik found the old role-playing formula slow, and he wanted an experience that filtered what he believed to be the most exciting element, the action. Diablo 1 was originally a turn-based game. Blizzard South told Brevik that they wanted him to make the game real-time, like Blizzard South's recent success, the strategy game Warcraft. Real-time was going places. Turn-based was yesterday's news. Brevik hated the idea, but was outvoted by his colleagues and agreed to make the conversion. Everyone left work that Friday except Brevik, who stayed back to begin what he believed would be the arduous task of coding real-time play into Diablo. Later that evening, he was smashing a skeleton in real time, and he was utterly hooked. Brevik never removed the turn-based mechanisms, instead tweaking them to run continuously and create the illusion of real time. You can see it if you scratch a little paint off the surface. The grid-based environment, the staggered animations and movement of characters. I saw Diablo listed somewhere as a strategy game. I can't remember where now, I think it was one of the sidebars in a Google search. And this feels close to accurate. Health and mana potions are commodities to be used carefully, and there's a strategy in knowing when to return to town, and when, or if, to spend your hard-earned gold. Vendors roll new items every time you return to town, and higher-end items cost a lot of dosh. You're constantly weighing the benefit of saving gold, which clutters inventory space, for that sweet payoff on a good item or a handful of attribute-boosting potions. Alright, stop. We need to talk about randomization and class balance. Classes were a late addition in Diablo's development cycle, only a few months from launch. There's always going to be balancing issues if you rush a system as significant as this. I rolled a sorcerer for my first run, opting for a pure build, that's how Blondie rolls, to see how Diablo handled magic. The run started great. I found a stack of Firebolt tomes early on, which supercharged my Firebolt spell. I had 7 levels of Firebolt by level 5 of the dungeon, and I was one-shotting most enemies. It was insane. Then, I realized that OBS wasn't recording sound in my footage. I hadn't got far, so I rolled another sorcerer to start again, and that's when the kick in the balls happened, showing me how much swing was in the RNG loot dance. The bookcases, which had showered me with arcane power on my first run, were conspicuously absent this time around. My spell levels largely stayed the same while the demons got tougher. play grew disproportionately harder as I descended, the loot rolls still unfavourable. Having played over 40 hours of Diablo, I can tell you that tome drops from enemies were rare, which meant finding them in the wild relied on bookcase spawns when the level was generated. Which didn't happen very bloody often. I saved cash to buy a pitiful number of tomes from Adria as they became available. When I defeated Diablo on my first run, many of the spells I had learned sat at level 1, and barely half my spellbook was filled. I also began to realise that it was plausible to brick an entire game if you weren't careful. Dungeons don't refill with enemies or items. Once they're gone for good. No more item drops, no more potion drops, no more gold. You'll be buying potions frequently from mid-game onwards, regardless of which class you pick, and you rely on item sales to fund the next dive into the labyrinth. Mana and health leech are sparse, and the effects minimal in this game. On a first-time playthrough, it's possible to blow most of your loot on expensive kit and have little left for the fight with Diablo. You won't make it through without health and or mana potions, and if you run out of potions and gold, you're dead in the water. Well, just dead, really. I also entered the Diablo fight with my sorcerer feeling underpowered, and this feels like a problem unique to the class. Perhaps the smart play is to save money and check Adria's stock as often as possible, but there's no way to know that on a blind play, my preferred approach. The loot problem is compounded by expectation. The best items appear in the wild in later titles. The warrior and rogue have an easier time. Weapon drops are more plentiful and keep pace with the difficulty. In another concession to traditional RPGs, combat uses a chance to hit metric. I would have been fine with this system if ranged combat wasn't so janky already. I wouldn't be surprised if this is a result of the turn-based code running in overdrive while maintaining many of the underlying turn-based systems. Projectiles have an annoying tendency to pass through creatures without registering a hit, even with high hit chance. It's most noticeable when you're trying to hit creatures that aren't on grid lines to the front, back, left or right of the hero. I lost count the number of times I'd launched a flurry of fireballs at a demon and have not a single one hit, despite all of them passing through the target. After experimentation, I found that I hit targets more consistently if they align directly to the front, back or sides, even if they're moving. The last few levels were a mind-numbing slog while I kited enemies a few at a time to line them up for ranged attacks. Areas with succubi and magi became bullet hell and had to be cleared carefully. Perhaps that makes sense for a turn-based game, but it's cumbersome in real time. And so we reach the biggest gripe I have with Diablo 1, a lack of mobility. I'm sure that surprises no one. Not even a lack of mobility options, there are none. The hero moves at one speed, Grandma. A couple of spells teleport the hero, but one picks a random nearby destination and spells have a mana requirement. Some ranged attacks are hard or impossible to avoid and maneuvering is frustrating and unoptimized. As an example, the Butcher, unlike most enemies, has no pause state. He never stops moving toward the hero. If you're playing a ranged character, you have a few shots tops before he's on you, and once he's caught up, he's like a dangling turd that just won't drop. I cheesed the Butcher fight, and I felt no shame doing it. Melee brings its own problems though. The hero moves from point to point thanks to the underlying grid system. You click a spot, the AI traces a path to that point. It starts to fall apart along walls and near corners. During later levels, I would try to trap a demon in a corner to finish it off, and the hero would bounce backward and forward between grid points as though they forgot the path they just took, all while the enemy lapped up cheap shots. My hero was sometimes so slippery that they even walked away when I clicked on an enemy. These pathing issues were common enough to dull my enthusiasm for the game, though they weren't particularly onerous until later levels. And Todd help you if you decide to purchase weapons. Can you spot which weapons are one- or two-handed? Here, take a moment. No? Give up? Yeah, I don't know either. You can guess at some, but swords in particular are a crapshoot. I tried to use the price as an indicator. Two-handed weapons tend to be more expensive, but that made a fool of me too. It was disheartening to sink 50,000 gold into a purchase only to discover the weapon was two-handed. This would have been easy to code in, just include dots in the item selection window, 1 dot for one-handed, 2 dots for two. I'm amazed no one identified this issue during playtesting. The cautious speed feels mostly natural during combat, as there are interesting choices to make when engaging enemies. Unless you have to chase an enemy, which is more frustrating than a Kotaku review. In the open hub of Tristram, however, movement feels glacial. Townsfolk are spread out, and restocking and speaking to everyone about quests can take at least a couple of minutes. The frequency that you return to town means that this will be a common annoyance, especially if you want to hear all quest responses. This sort of speed was probably blazing for RPGs of the era. Players were used to more ponderous gameplay, and RPGs had thought-provoking choices and lots to read. Lots and lots to read. Patience was a necessity. We've come a long way since then. I might sound like a nitpicking arsehole, but I enjoyed the earlier levels. Character animations are smooth, combat sounds augment the experience, such as the hollow clop as you slice the cranium off a zombie, or the death choke of a scavenger as it goes belly up. The alluring sound of gold and item drops still triggers the excitable kleptomaniac in me. Sound was consistently high quality, and there's no doubt it embellished the experience in devilishly delightful ways. The slow pace and reliance on potions made gameplay feel more considered and tactical, and to my surprise, I enjoyed that quite a bit. My point is that gameplay can be satisfying, especially the earlier levels, but late game feels like a slog with few tactical alternatives. It's not unreasonable to expect to be able to play a pure build of a class if that class exists. Is it? Diablo was slated to have a fully fleshed story, with the hero playing a prominent role in the narrative. It's a shame they decided to drop it, as the rest of the lore is so lovingly crafted. If Diablo were a written novel, it would begin near the climax, late into the book. The inciting incident and all the bad stuff has already happened, and the hero is now heading toward the final confrontation. If you've read the manual, you already know what's coming. If you haven't read the manual, the cover art should have been a massive fucking clue. We don't know how much the hero knows about the situation, but that's irrelevant because, outside of a handful of comments, the hero is a blank canvas. This isn't a criticism. There is little to distract the player from the gameplay loop. Fight, loot, restock. From the beginning of the game, we're so far into the overarching story that player agency is clear, and there's nothing left for the hero to figure out. It's player versus demon, and it doesn't end at the final cinematic. More on that in a minute. Each playthrough rolls a random set of side quests from a limited pool. This further randomizes the content and experience of every game, and means that multiple playthroughs are needed to see all the side quests that Diablo offers. The quests are well written into the world, but are underutilized. They add bite-sized snippets of lore which expand the grim setting with bleak brushstrokes, but the quests have no impact on the hero or the story. For example, the Poison Well quest should have a dire outcome if it's not resolved. The entire town can't get no high-quality H2O. Yet, there's no penalty for ignoring this quest. The villagers are happy to drink arse water. The butcher had surface dwellers kidnapped and brought to his slaughter room, yet his activity ceases, even if you ignore him. These quests could have been given emotional and narrative weight with a simple monologue at the end of the game, like Fallout, highlighting the consequences of failed quests. Or, the quests could have negatively affected vendors or the population of Tristram, giving players a greater sense of agency. Quests exist to give the player something else to do along the path to hell. It's a shame because the quests are cohesively crafted into the setting. It's a missed opportunity to leave them unpolished. They could have had real impact, if not directly to the story, then to gameplay. Diablo's lore is worth investing in if you're even remotely curious or into that sort of thing. The heraldic texts in the manual mention many characters who appear in the sequels, and they provide a foundation for the larger scale settings of Diablo 2 and 3. The devil has long been a symbol of pure evil, even among the non-religious. He is a corrupter of souls, a purveyor of nightmare, the insidious whisper of madness which seized Lazarus and Leoric. Diablo's original antagonist was going to be the devil, This must have been an early concept because the lore on Diablo's Hell is expanded significantly to include the 7 circles of Hell, with each being ruled by a great evil. The devil idea was obviously scrapped, but some aspects of it remain in Diablo's spiny visage, and it's hard to shake that feeling as you descend into the blood-soaked halls of his domain. The titular prime evil awaits the hero beyond the suffering and hordes of demons, surrounded by a host of his toughest minions. Diablo has taken Prince Albrecht, King Leoric's son, as a host and warped the boy's body into his own familiar form. The fight with Diablo is sudden. No fanfare, no cutscene, no build-up. You throw a bunch of switches in the final level and suddenly there he is, released from a previously hidden chamber, loping towards you like a hellish ape. Even in his weakened state, Diablo is formidable. People have long since figured out how to trivialize this fight, but when running a blind playthrough, he's a challenge. I died countless times thanks to a lack of mobility and his Armageddon spell, which he spams constantly, and is almost always unavoidable unless you break line of sight. My squishy sorcerer had a rough go of that fight. For anyone who feels the need to point out that Mana Shield exists, I never found a single tome for it on this run. And yeah, I stumbled across the Holy Bolt strategy and was intrigued enough to give it a try. When Diablo is finally defeated, you get a cutscene for your trouble. Let's chat about that. Brevik had an ending written for Diablo. A happy ending, with a satisfying conclusion. Something befitting a hero's efforts. Many fantasy games of the time had positive endings, and Brevik saw no reason to stray from that formula. He left the end script with the animators. When they revealed their work shortly before Diablo's release, Brevik was dismayed. The animators, unhappy with the script, had completely rewritten the ending and built a cutscene based on their own vision, without consulting Brevik. He was angry and disappointed. This wasn't the way it was supposed to go, but it was far too late to redo it. The game ends with the hero prying loose the soul stone embedded in Diablo's skull. Diablo shrinks into the form of Albrecht, the boy gasping a final breath. The hero, with barely a moment's hesitation, jams the pointed end of the soul stone into his forehead, trapping Diablo within his own body in a token of self-sacrifice. The hero then heads east, hoping to find answers to the evil which now corrupts him, fighting for control. No grand parade, no gratitude from the people of Tristram. No, thank you. The hero flees town, understanding that he will likely succumb to Diablo, but hoping that he will find answers first and possibly, hopefully, even save himself. In retrospect, it's easy to see that this was the correct conclusion to the story. Tristram is a place of suffering, fear, and misery, and this is further revealed by the hero's descent. Despite the evils vanquished, the obstacles overcome, the artifacts recovered, the souls redeemed, nothing in Tristram changes, for better or worse. It is a limbo town on the precipice of ruin. I have seen comments which sum up Diablo 1's theme as the struggle between good and evil. I disagree, and the ending is my exclamation point. What few inhabitants remain are fighting for their town, for their livelihoods, for their very souls. Diablo's malevolent presence gnaws on their fear. His servants terrorize and threaten the surrounding countryside. It's a cycle doomed to chase its own tail until Diablo is strong enough to devour all. Diablo's corruption is, if not permanent, at the very least a long road to recovery. Leoric was permanently damaged by Diablo's attempts at full possession. The villagers of Tristram may not be direct targets of Diablo's corruptive ire, but they suffer from his presence. There could be no lasting peace, no future prosperity of Tristram. Diablo 1's theme is the corruptibility of the mortal soul, how it works in degrees to subvert even the most noble of goals. And as the hero travels east seeking answers, they bring Diablo closer to his brothers and an inevitable reunion of the prime evils. Free thought or cunning corruption? There's a discrepancy in the story, a blip between the manual and the end cutscene. The manual states that when Archbishop Lazarus found the Soul Stone, he smashed it to release Diablo. Diablo later took possession of Albrecht, and while the process of possession isn't detailed, it's inferred that it was a non-physical process. The ending, however, shows Albrecht with a soulstone jammed into his skull, the soulstone that Lazarus shattered in the manual. I couldn't find a source that says the Diablo 1 manual was retconned or is not considered canon. The manual was likely drafted and printed before Brevik saw the final cutscene, and this was simply a narrative oversight, but I still find it interesting. The Diablo wiki also omits mention of Tyrael, the Great Evils, and other characters in Diablo 1. Someone might point out that they aren't mentioned because they aren't physically in the game, but there are other character attributations in the wiki who are also only mentioned in the game. Perhaps they're not included because they are not referred to directly in the game and only in the manual. But that's merely semantics. Lore is lore. Strange, given that this was the genesis for their inclusion in the Diablo mythos in future titles. These are curios for you Diablo lore masters. If you know the reason, drop me a comment. I'm curious to know. Diablo's ending follows the structure of horror fiction. The evil has been vanquished for now, which wraps up the story, but we understand that it can, and obviously does, return. The bleak ending isn't surprising when measured against everything which has led to this point. The gothic setting, the macabre quest lines and lore, the fearful residents of Tristram. When people say they enjoy Diablo 1 for the atmosphere, this is what they mean. The tangible thread of fear and hopelessness which link everything together. There's a pervasive darkness which follows the hero the entire journey, an unsettling and unshakable feeling that there is no light, not anymore. This is why you should play Diablo 1, if atmosphere is your jam. Diablo 2 may have vastly superior gameplay, but the intimate and claustrophobic bleakness of Diablo 1 is unrivaled in the series. If you're one of those blondies who skips the manual to get balls deep in the action, you're probably focused on the singular goal of stopping the titular prime evil. And who doesn't want to get balls deep in demon slaying? Slow down. Breathe. Push through it. Let's talk about the writing. Something Blizzard are well known and loved for, particularly with their older games, is their ability to craft expansive, rich worlds. There's a good deal of worldcraft in Diablo, should you choose to immerse yourself. You don't have to, of course, but it's there to lend credence and history to the events, people, and items you encounter. I recommend reading the manual. That might be a dirty opinion for some people, but get over yourself and listen. Manuals are a lost art. When people say they miss game manuals, it's for games like Diablo that they're referring to. Diablo's manual is more than instructional. It's packed with history, Haradrim, hell, and hegemony. Quotes and counsel line the black column of many pages, some from real authors or poets, others part of the fictional setting, but all contributing to a sense of pious duty and mystical foreboding. Gorgeous sketches from the talented hands of Samwise Didier and Chris Metzen depict the grim setting. Their art styles and writing voice will be instantly familiar to many. The creative toil that these lads have done is worth your time, so get in there.
Since the beginning, the forces of light and darkness have engaged in an eternal war, the Great Conflict, whose victor will rise from the apocalyptic ashes to hold sway over all creation.
So begins our education from the Librarius ex Haradrim, Book 1 of Heaven and Hell. If your gut tells you that you're a pawn in a much bigger game, you're on the right track. Brace yourself. There's a story here and we're charging headfirst. Since time begun, the forces of heaven and hell met in brutal conflicts, but neither side could hold the balance of power in their favor for long. Iswal, a lieutenant in Heaven's army, executed an ambitious attack on the Hellforge, where a demon blade called Shadowfang was nearing completion. His attack failed, and Iswal was lost to the darkness. It wasn't until the ascension of man and the mortal realm that the great conflict spluttered to a halt. Both sides realized the unique ability of man to choose between the light and the darkness, and both believed that this would be the deciding factor in the great conflict. Agents from both factions were sent to the mortal realm to sway the favor of man. The migration of the great conflict into the mortal world marked the beginning of the Sin War. Angels and demons disguised themselves and walked among the mortals, trying to lure them to their respective causes. The forces of darkness realized that man was more easily cowed by force than coercion, and began to terrorize mortals into submission. Angels defended humanity where they could, but the severity of their holy discipline and their punishments alienated the people they strove to protect. Man seldom saw the battles of the Sin War. Heaven and hell were careful to maintain their masquerade. Only a few enlightened beings were aware of the agents among them. Some mortals willingly accepted the call of the Sin War, allying with the side and becoming great champions. Lesser demons were forced to kneel before powerful mortal avatars, and the creatures of darkness grew to hate man, cursing them and believing them the cause for the power deadlock which stifled their victory. A mortal, Horizon the Summoner, learned of the demons' hatred towards mortals and used this knowledge to entrap, study, and document them. Horizon and his brother Bartuk were mages of an eastern clan called the Vids, who had studied and catalogued the demons for generations. The demons, incensed by this cunning manipulation, attacked Horizon, but he was well protected inside his arcane sanctuary. The demons turned their attention to the more vulnerable Bartuk, and converted him to the darkness. Bartuk fought alongside Hell, earning a vicious reputation. The darkness inside him became all-consuming, and Bartuk developed a taste for bathing in the blood of the fallen, earning him the title, the Warlord of Blood. Restlessness grew among some of the great evils. Duriel, Lord of Pain, Andariel, Maiden of Anguish, Belial, Lord of Lies, and Azmodan, Lord of Sin. These lesser four evils grew frustrated. They began to question the power and ability of their higher brothers. Only three beings stood between the lesser evils and ultimate power, the prime evils. Mephisto, Lord of Hatred, Baal, Lord of Destruction, and Diablo, Lord of Terror. The prime evils ruled over their lesser brothers with brutal force and malicious cunning, but that authority was eroding. Azmodan and Belial formed a pact with their lesser brethren and concocted a plan to oust the prime evils. A calamitous battle raged through Hell as the prime evils fought back, decimating a third of Hell's traitorous army. But they were ultimately outnumbered. The prime evils, now weakened, were stripped of their bodies and their essences banished to the mortal realm. This event was known as the Dark Exile. Azmodan believed that heaven would refocus its efforts on the three, now let loose in the mortal plane, and leave the gates of heaven open to a crushing invasion. Their ambition turned to anger as they fought among themselves for the lion's share of power. The bickering escalated to open warfare between Azmodan and Belial. That war still rages. The three evils entered the mortal plane while it was still young. Mankind was unprepared, and the three evils stalked the world, feeding upon the vices of man and sowing chaos. A secretive order of mortal magi gathered by the Archangel Tyrael was drafted to hunt the three. The order was called the Heradrim. They succeeded in capturing Mephisto and Baal within artifacts called Soulstones. These Soulstones were buried beneath the dunes of the desolate eastern sands. Peace settled over the eastern lands, but the Heradrim continued their search for Diablo, following tales of terror and anarchy to the west. After a great battle led by Heradrim initiate Jared Kane, Diablo was finally imprisoned within the remaining Soulstone. The Heradrim monks buried the Soulstone in a secluded cavern near the river Talsande, in the lands of Kondurus. They constructed a monastery on the site, and their order remained to safeguard the Soulstone. Over time, they dug labyrinthine basements and tunnels to house their dead. The numbers of the Heradrim dwindled until the order eventually fell into obscurity, and the great monastery crumbled under the ravages of time and neglect. Nevertheless, villagers thrived around the ruin, though none knew of its dark secret. The people of the Western lands grew in number. Pilgrims from the east settled in the lands surrounding Kandurus and formed kingdoms. A new religion, known as Zakarum, spread through the kingdom of Westmarch. Zakarum shunned the darkness and embraced the light. Westmarch grew frustrated that their neighbours weren't adopting their religious dogma. A northern lord named Leoric travelled south into Kandurus with his archbishop, Lazarus, and an entourage of knights and priests to declare himself king. They made their way to the city of Tristram, and Leoric took the old crumbling monastery on the outskirts as his seat of power. He renovated the place, returning it to its former glory. The people were unhappy with this enforced lordship, but Leoric's strength and justice endeared them over time and they grew to respect him. Leoric's arrival coincided with Diablo's awakening within the Soulstone, deep under the monastery. Diablo sensed that his release was within grasp and invaded the nightmares of Archbishop Lazarus. Lazarus sprinted through the hallways blind with terror. His feet bore him to the Soulstone far under the earth. A final hammering of terror destroyed what little remained of Lazarus's will, and he raised the Soulstone above his head and shattered it on the floor. The Lord of Terror was free once more. But Diablo was greatly weakened from his incarceration, and sought a soul to inhabit and conquer. He settled his malevolent sights on King Leoric. Leoric fought the corruption invading his mind, aware of its presence but blind to its source. The secret internal battle scoured all virtue and honor from his soul. Over time he grew dark, bitter, and resentful. His appearance changed, no longer upright and proud, but stooped and grim. Lazarus too was under the sway of his dark master, a willing thrall for Diablo's machinations. Lazarus was advisor and manipulator to the corrupted Leoric, isolating him from the people who cared about him and sowing insidious seeds to take root in Leoric's mind. Lacdanon, a champion of Zakarum and hero of the light, tried to discern the affliction ailing Leoric. When Lazarus found out, he charged Lacdanon with treason, a charge no one in the court would believe. The king's madness was becoming more evident each day. In a desperate bid to maintain control of the situation, Lazarus convinced Leoric that the kingdom of Westmarch plotted against them. Leoric grew enraged and declared war against Westmarch, ignoring his advisors and ordering his armies to march north against the duplicitous kingdom. Lazarus, sensing an opportunity to be rid of all opposition, ordered Lacdanon and many powerful officials to leave the doomed army. Most never returned. Diablo assaulted Leoric's ravaged soul, seeking domination. But a sliver of stubborn spirit remained in the Mad King, which refused to roll over. A frustrated Diablo turned his gaze on a softer target. Prince Albrecht, Leoric's son. Lazarus kidnapped the young prince, and Diablo subjected Albrecht to the most hideous nightmares crawling inside his own mind. Albrecht's head danced with screaming demons and hideous abominations, and Diablo gave these nightmares life, releasing them into the mortal world. The labyrinth itself became grotesquely warped by Albrecht's terror, and hell tore through to the mortal world, making a quasi-semi-complete home in the depths under Tristram. Diablo shaped Albrecht's body into his own. The Lord of Terror was born again. It was just a matter of time until the three primevals were united once more. Leoric, overcome with grief at the disappearance of his son, accused the villagers of the prince's kidnap, and many villagers were hung. Lacdanon returned from the war with a fraction of the army that had initially set forth. Upon learning of the cruel creature that Leoric had become, Lacdanon hunted him down and sorrowfully ran him through in the catacombs under the monastery. With Leoric's dying breath, he cursed Lacdanon and the knights with him, calling upon the power of hell to eternally damn all present. Tristram grieved for its lost king and anxiously pondered what lay ahead. Dark riders roamed the highways, strange creatures appeared in the land, and unholy screams echoed from the monastery. Lazarus returned some time after Leoric's death, appearing in the village and convincing the townsfolk to push into the monastery and find their young prince, who could rule and heal their grief. Emboldened by Lazarus's zeal, a mob of angry townsfolk gathered and followed him into the monastery. Few returned, and those who did frightened the rest with first-hand accounts of the horrors and grisly death that awaited them below. Diablo gorged on the fresh fear spreading through the town, feeding his strength and biding his time. And this is where the game begins. That's a pretty involved backstory. Diablo's writers, Chris Metzen, Bill Roper, Eric Sexton, and Eric Schaefer, had a field day with this game, crafting a history to frame the conflict to come. We understand that defeating Diablo is necessary, but framed within the context of the Sin War, it becomes that much more urgent. It raises the stakes without the prodding that other games feel is necessary to motivate the player. Much of this detail is only in the manual, making it completely optional. You're missing out if you skip it. The prose is heavy on adjectives, wicked spears and shattered spirits and hideous laughter. It can be laid on a little thick, but there's an undeniable charm to the writing, and it's so quintessentially Diablo. It's a writing voice that you can pick immediately once you've heard it. The writers paint broad strokes when describing the world, and use familiarization to draw rough parallels to the real world, which makes the geography of Diablo's world easily and quickly relatable. There are eastern and western lands, with the east being settled much earlier than the west. The East is the cradle of civilization, knowledge, magic, and learning. The peoples of the East are held in high regard as arcane scholars, fountains of ancient knowledge, and are talented in the mystic and magical arts. Their inspiration draws from numerous European cultures, with particular influence coming from the romanticized old world views of the Middle East. There are characters who carve out their niche in the history of the Great Conflict. Many characters appear or are mentioned in the game, but some are referenced only in the manual, such as Archangel Tyrael, Iswal, and Horizon. The story and lore raise a few questions. Firstly, if the Soulstones were so important, why was only one safeguarded by a monastery? Or, looking at it from a different angle, if the deserts of the East were such an inhospitable and potent place to lose things, why not bring Diablo's Soulstone east to begin with? This point feels incongruent with how tenacious and meticulous the Haradrim are depicted when chasing the prime evils. Giving the Haradrim's power, if they didn't want to make the journey east again, why not seal the Soulstone underground and collapse the cave? Second, what is the meaning of the sword in the opening cinematic? I couldn't find an answer to this, and it's a question plenty of others have asked online. In fiction writing, there's an adage called Chekhov's gun, which says, if you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. The meaning behind this adage is that if an object is emphasized, it's implied that the object has relevance. The sword had meaning at some point, probably during early development when ideas were still fluid. It was likely shelved along with the original storyline for the hero, but exists in the final product because of budget and time constraints. Still, it's a mysterious and tantalizing relic, a historic hint of the game Diablo might have been. And the final point. Why don't the minions of hell devour Tristram? They have superior numbers and power. I think this point is adequately explained by the presence of Diablo. Although he is free of his magical prison, Diablo is weakened and must gather his power. The manual demonstrates that he draws power from the emotions of fear and terror. Obliterating Tristram would deprive him of the sustenance he needs to grow stronger. Fear is his G-fuel, but Diablo is reduced to sipping through a straw. So, he encircles the town with creatures and bides his time, siphoning the townsfolk and reveling in the terror which grips the land. I love this depth of world building. Blizzard demonstrate why they are, or were to many, one of the best in the industry. The gothic world of Diablo lends itself well to dark adventure and perilous dungeon crawling, and it is the perfect setting for a gripping yarn. The gruesome themes present a mature setting, and I find that immediately appealing and want to learn more about it. The Dark Exile shows the tenuous balance of power among the great evils, who come across as the squabbling, scheming siblings that they are. You won't learn a lot of this if you only play the game. If you don't own the game, the manual is freely available from Blizzard at the time of publication of this video. Link is in the description below. Do yourself a favour. Read it. Let's talk about the Hellfire expansion. The expansion that Blizzard North wouldn't approve, which was then released behind their back. To this day, Brevik doesn't believe it was a good fit. But Hellfire contains quality of life improvements which objectively make the game better. I rolled a fighter for this run and went through the campaign again, just for you blondies. You're welcome. Hellfire builds on the existing gameplay and item diversity and adds 8 more dungeon levels for higher level heroes. It also streamlines some of the mechanics from vanilla Diablo. Heroes can now sprint in town, thank fuck. Pepin automatically heals the hero when he's spoken to, and Griswold's inventory doesn't automatically reset every time you visit town, meaning that you can save to buy that expensive Skull Crusher. Griswold's persistent inventory isn't perfect. Inventory items shift upward a spot when the hero levels, with the item at the top disappearing and a new item appearing at the bottom. This means that items cycle regularly during the early and mid-game, but slow and become stagnant in the later game. If you purchase from Griswold, you'll be cherry-picking items, and the late game leads to a glut of unwanted crap filling up his inventory. The only way to get rid of them is to buy them. It looked like Adria suffered from the same problem, but she wasn't relevant to my playstyle, so I wasn't paying as much attention. The item pool has been drastically increased, including new prefixes and suffixes for magical items, and new unique items. More spells have been added to give spellcasters an easier time. New oils can be applied to weapons and armor to boost damage or defense or to repair damage. Runes can be found or bought which function as proximity mines. A new class, the Monk, has been added, and 2 more classes can be unlocked by poking the ini file. Don't expect new character models though. It's hard to say from a single playthrough whether these additions fundamentally change the game for better or worse. There are so many variables that determine the experience of a single playthrough, so let's look at the new stuff. The armor and weapon oils are almost never used. They're helpful going into a tough boss fight, but my warrior had no problem with most encounters and I never felt pressed to use them. They could be more valuable at higher difficulties. Runes fall into the same category. Enemies move erratically and it can be tough to get them where you want them. I found it quicker to carve skulls. I can see their use, but again, I never felt compelled to use them outside of curiosity. The new spells may be a good equalizer for magic users, but my warrior never used them, and I didn't collect a large number of tomes on my run. The changes I appreciated most were the run speed in town, Pepin's insta-heal, and Griswold's persistent inventory, flawed as it is. The new dungeons, the Festering Nest and Demon Crypts, are a mixed bag. The Festering Nest is a shit show of colour. The insectile setting was fine, and the enemies were appropriately creepy, but the colour palette made it hard to see items in the environment. Items were also easily obscured behind walls, and the passages and open areas were a confusing mess. The level of detail in the Demon Crypts was awesome, though their random generation felt a bit too samey. The lava under the gridded floor was a nice touch, nothing like lava to tell you should probably leave. The liches are on par with the Magi and Succubi and can fuck right off. If you're forced a decision and threaten me with Twitter outrage, I recommend playing vanilla Diablo first. This is the experience that many fell in love with, and I'm a purist. If you reach a point where you're not enjoying it, Hellfire probably won't win you over. Diablo is a time capsule, a snapshot of the gaming industry on the cusp of discovering a new genre. Unlike Doom and other trailblazers though, time hasn't been kind to the gameplay of Diablo. It's easy to get into, but difficult to persist with toward the late game, and its shortcomings are starkly highlighted by the refined formula of its successors. Regardless, many people still hold Diablo 1 in high regard, and it's easy to see why. There's a dark, moody charm to the setting, delightful in its grim outlook and fearful characters, and the random dungeon and loot generation guarantees a fresh experience every time. The world building of Diablo is evocative and grand, even if the majority of it has no bearing on the immediate gameplay. The decision to tightly focus the story on Tristram is clever, though characters and quest lines are underutilized. Gillian and Ogden deserve better. The manual is a quality blend of storytelling and instruction, designed not just to inform, but to draw the player deep into the world. By now, you have probably decided whether Diablo is for you. It may have captured your attention, hooked your curiosity, and dragged you down through the blood-soaked hallways and aged wooden doors, through the stagnant earthen catacombs thick with ancient secrets, across the lakes of bubbling fire and sulfur fumes, and into the dark, bony heart of hell, surrounded by malformed demonic flesh art. Dare you chase your curiosity, adventurer?